have with me on the line Michael. You there, Michael?
Yes, I am. Yes,
Hi,
I
Michael.
am. I'm right here.
Sure. So, as I say, Michael, I could talk forever about ancient artifacts, and you've provided such a wealth. I urge anybody who hasn't read Forbidden Archaeology to go out and get it because it's a good starting point, I think, for people with your work, Michael. But your latest publication from November 2012 is called My Science, My Religion. What's the elements of your newest work, Michael?
Well, this book includes 24 papers that I've presented at mainstream scientific conferences, mostly on archaeology or history of science. And these papers deal with the kind of evidence that I've reported in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and with other topics that I'm also interested in. After, people read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, they said, well, you've got all this evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins. So do you have any alternative explanation for where we came from? So to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And in that book, I said, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from? We should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? Now today, many scientists will say we're just machines made of matter. That's what we are. And as far as consciousness is concerned, they would say, well, if you combine the atoms in the brain or the molecules in the brain in a very complex way, they produce what we call consciousness, but only temporarily and only in association with the brain. When the molecules are disorganized at the time of death, then there's no more consciousness. So it's a very materialistic conception of what we are. But what I'm proposing in my book, Human Devolution, is that consciousness exists separately from matter. It has its own independent existence. And what we are originally is beings of pure consciousness. So under that conception, we don't evolve up from matter, as many scientists now believe. Rather, we devolve or come down from the level of pure consciousness. So there's some scientific evidence that shows consciousness has its own independent existence. This evidence comes from medical studies of out-of-body experiences, psychiatric studies of past life memories, and things like that. So that's another topic that I talk about in some of my scientific papers that I've presented at scientific conferences, evidence for consciousness existing apart from matter. So as I said, in my book, My Science, My Religion, there are 24 papers presented at mainstream scientific conferences where I talk about these things. And the reason I think that's important is that when many people hear about the kinds of things that we're talking about, archaeological evidence that contradicts the current theories, evidence for consciousness existing apart from matter, they think, well, that is just stuff that you're going to hear about on, in the tabloid newspapers or on wildly sensationalistic radio or TV programs. But whatever it is, it's not part of science. So what I wanted to show in this book, My Science, My Religion, is that these things are part of modern scientific discussion. And the proof of it is these papers that I presented at major international scientific conferences. And another thing that this book shows is that it's not true that science and religion have to be completely separate. I'm very open in my scientific presentation about the spiritual inspiration for my work. I'm very open that my work is inspired by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, the spiritual text of ancient India. So I think it's very important for people to understand that science and religion are not, as many people believe, completely separate endeavors.
I think people would like to think there's a disconnect there, but I don't think that's true anymore, Michael. And definitely with your research, you seem to be providing this platform where people can really indulge in it, and you're providing something that hasn't been there before, Michael, I think too. Could you elaborate on some of the papers in the book that deal with archaeology, Michael?
Well, the first paper that I presented at a scientific conference was in 1994. I went to a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. Now, that's one of the world's largest international organizations of archaeologists, and they have a meeting every 4 years in a different country. So that year, 1994, they held their meeting in New Delhi, India. And I thought, well, this is the perfect place for me to present my ideas. So I presented a paper there called Puranic Time and the Archaeological Record. So the Puranas are the historical writings of ancient India, and they have a cyclical concept of time, where time goes in vast cycles. But according to the Puranas, humans have been present throughout all these vast cycles of time. So I believe there's archaeological evidence that supports that, and I have reported it in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. But I also presented it in this paper, Puranic Time and the Archaeological Record. Now, when you present a paper at a scientific conference, first of all, you have to submit a proposal, and they can accept it or reject it. So I thought it was significant that they accepted my proposal to accept this paper where I explained the time concept in ancient India and the archaeological evidence that shows that humans existed throughout all these vast cycles of time. And not only was the paper accepted for presentation at this major international scientific conference, it was later published in a peer-reviewed scientific book called Time and Archaeology that was published by Routledge, a major scientific publisher. Now, so sometimes people want to ask me, well, do you have peer-reviewed scientific publications? And the answer is yes. And many people find that, very surprising, but it is a fact.
Sure. And some of your papers involve paranormal research. Could you tell us about them, Michael?
Well, yes. There's not only a forbidden archaeology, there's also a forbidden physics. In my alternative conception of human origins, I recognize three things. First of all, the body made of molecules, made of ordinary matter. That's part of what we are as human beings. But beyond that, there is a subtle mind element that has some very unusual powers. You might call paranormal powers, like remote viewing and extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, mind over matter types of abilities. So when many people hear about such things, they think, well, this is just totally outside the bounds of acceptable science. But I think such people aren't really aware of the actual history of science, which I've talked about in some of my scientific papers that are included in this book, My Science, My Religion. And I've spoken about these things at major international science conferences, for example, conferences on consciousness studies in science. And here's an example of one of the cases that I presented in these scientific papers. Many people have heard of Marie and Pierre Curie. They're mentioned in every introductory physics book. They were husband and wife. They were working in Paris, France, early in the 20th century, and they got Nobel Prizes for their work in discovering radium and the phenomenon of radioactivity when that was first being developed early in the 20th century. So that's in every physics textbook. But what you don't read in the physics textbooks is that they were heavily involved in psychical research into the paranormal. They were part of 20 prominent European scientists who were studying such things in Paris early in the 20th century. And this group of scientists was doing research into a medium, an Italian lady named Eusapia Palladino, who had psychokinetic abilities, mind over matter abilities. So the experiments with this woman medium took place at the Psychology Institute in Paris. And on one occasion, they had the medium in the laboratory. Marie Curie was holding her hands. Other scientists were holding her feet, making sure she couldn't move at all. And in the middle of the lab, in broad daylight, Pierre Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said that a large table was floating about 1 meter off the ground in the presence of this woman. Said he felt all around, there weren't any wires or anything. This table was floating there in the presence of all these scientists, including Marie and Pierre Curie. It's not something you're going to read about in the physics textbooks, but it's part of the actual history of physics that I've reported in some of my scientific papers that are included in this new book, My Science, My Religion.
Right. Are there precedents that exist for this work? Are there historical figures that have reconciled science and religion that you have done, Michael?
Well, yes, there are. And one of them is a pretty interesting character. It's Alfred Russel Wallace. Was, along with Darwin, the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Originally, the theory was called the Wallace-Darwin theory, because actually Darwin had been working on the theory for a long time, for 20 years, before he published The Origin of Species. So one day, before he published The Origin of Species, he got a letter from Wallace in which Wallace laid out the whole theory of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin was shocked. Wallace was going to publish a paper about it, and the person who publishes it first gets their name on it, a theory. So Darwin was very upset by this, so he consulted with his scientific friends, and they told him, well, the only thing you could possibly do is get Wallace to agree that you would both present papers at an English scientific society at the same time. on the same day, and that way you'll both get credit for the theory. So that's what happened. Wallace and Darwin presented papers on the same day at the Linnaean Society in London, and the proceedings were later published, and therefore they both got credit for the theory. So for a long time it was called the Wallace-Darwin theory, but Wallace's name was taken off of it when he got involved in psychical research into the paranormal. So Wallace sort of combined his interest in the paranormal with his ideas about evolution, but Darwin just hated that. And, so Wallace's name kind of got dropped, pushed from the theory. But Wallace was a person who was able to combine his spiritual and his scientific interests in what I regard as a very interesting way. And there have been other scientists who have also been able to do that, but I think Wallace is a good example of it.
Right. So another one of the papers gives a spiritual perspective on the environmental crisis. Could you, just for the listeners, share something about that?
Well, that's one of my interests, the environmental crisis. And what I've found is that researchers who've looked deeply into it see that ultimately it's a spiritual problem that demands a spiritual solution. Because what the root of the environmental crisis is our tendency to overproduce and overconsume material things. Basically, that's what's causing the environmental destruction and pollution. We're building so many factories that are producing so many material things, and that's poisoning the earth, poisoning the land, poisoning the water. So if we're really going to solve this environmental crisis, it means we're going to have to voluntarily reduce the level of material production and consumption. And that is ultimately, I think, a spiritual problem that has to deal with the amount of greed that's there in the human heart. And how is that going to be reduced? I think it can only be reduced by spiritual practices that give people non-material happiness and consumption. In other words, there are spiritual techniques that can give people some inner happiness and satisfaction, so they won't be searching so much for external means of satisfaction. So I talked about that at a major international conference on environmental studies, and it's one of the papers that's included in this book, My Science, My Religion.
India is fascinating too. Tell us a little bit about the history of archaeology in India itself, as you've outlined in some of the academic papers. I think that's important too, Michael.
Well, a lot of people think that archaeology began with European and American scientists. And say if you look at a standard history of archaeology in India, they say, well, archaeology began in India when European travelers came there in the 17th century and started digging up things and writing about ancient ruins that they found there. So that's what you see in the textbooks. And even Indian archaeologists, they accept that. But what I found in my studies is that there was an independent archaeological tradition in India that existed, before the Europeans came there. And it involves things like different saints and mystics seeing in dreams and visions the locations of lost sacred images and sacred places. And they would go to these places and dig, and they would find what they saw in their dreams and visions. So they excavated these objects, these ancient objects, sacred images mostly, and built new temples to house them and things like that. So that is a kind of spiritual archaeology that I think deserves to be called archaeology. And I've presented papers on this spiritual archaeological tradition in India at meetings of the European Association of Archaeologists and the European Association of South Asian Archaeology and Art. And one of my papers on this topic was published in Antiquity, which is one of the main scientific journals on archaeology. It's published in England, actually. So it's an interesting topic, and I think there are other examples of it from other places in the world of indigenous archaeological traditions, and many archaeologists are very interested in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my fiance is a horticulturist, so she's going to love this next question. In chapter 13, it features a fascinating study of the anomalous fossil evidence for extreme antiquity of plants. Can you explain this phenomenon for us, Michael?
Yeah. My main topic, of course, is extreme human antiquity, evidence showing that humans like us were present millions, even hundreds of millions of years ago. So sometimes some people have asked me, well, is it just that our picture of human history needs to be reformed and reconstructed on the basis of the kind of evidence that you're talking about? But what about other species, plants and animals, for example? Is perhaps our view of their history also in need of revision? And I think the answer to that question is yes. Of course, I've really focused on the human species because that's what most of us human beings are concerned with. I found evidence that perhaps our picture of the origin of different plant species also needs to be radically revised. The current picture of the origin of flowering plants is that flowering plants first came into existence about 100 million years ago, maybe 150 million years ago at most. And when I say flowering plants, the technical term for them is angiosperms. And they include not just roses and lilies and things like that, but most of the plants that we use for food are from the flowering plant or angiosperm family. All the grains that we eat, the vegetables, the fruits, they come from the flowering plant family. So, as I said, the standard scientific conception today is that the flowering plants came into existence about 100 million years ago. But I was doing some research, and I found some scientific reports that show that the flowering plants actually first emerged or were present 500 or 600 million years ago, at a time when most scientists think there weren't any forms of life, either plant or animal, on the land at all. So this evidence comes from the Salt Range Mountains in what's now Pakistan. In the 1930s and 40s, scientists were researching that area. It was part of India at that time. And they were looking into some salt mines in the Salt Range Mountains. And over a mile deep in these salt mines and sedimentary deposits that were found there, these scientists found evidence for the existence of flowering plants and formations from the Cambrian period that goes back over 500 million years. So in one of my scientific papers, I reported on this evidence, and that paper is included in this book, My Science, My Religion.
Fascinating, Michael. You know, it's strange you mentioned that. I'm sitting with a piece of Himalayan rock salt from the Pakistan mines that you just spoke about in front of me. It's a candle holder, which I always set at light for all my radio shows. It's so strange.
Yeah, I went to, part of my research, I went to that salt mine. It's in the Kura Gorge in the Range Mountains in Pakistan. And it's the kind of salt that comes out of there is of a pinkish color.
That's right. It's a pink rock salt that I have, and my fiance is big into health, and we've both become vegetarians in the last recent while, and we're now taking this Himalayan rock salt as an alternative to normal salt. You make up a solution in a bottle and stuff. It's supposed to have something like 84 different benefits, so it's a fascinating substance.
Yeah, many people like the natural salts, especially coming from that, that rock salt from those Himalayan mines in Pakistan and the Salt Range Mountains was traded widely over the Indian subcontinent. And you mentioned being a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian for over 40 years now. I find it's very good, for my mental and spiritual health.
Well, I'm feeling the difference again. I have tried on 3 occasions, and I struggle. I've got such a high metabolism, but the thing is, I actually do like beans and I do like my greens, and it's adopting a new regime and committing, and eventually you just fall into place. So I'm so scared with meat products.
It's up to each individual, but I've been doing it for 40 years, but back to the salt, it comes from very deep mines in the Salt Range Mountains. And what the researchers found at that time is that there'd be a layer of salt, and there'd be a layer of sediments, and then another layer of salt, and another layer of sediments. And it was in the layers of sediments, between the layers of salts, that they were finding evidence for the existence of flowering plants. They were finding plant tissues and plant pollen.
Right.
Characteristic of the angiosperms or flowering plant family. So kind of interesting. A little bit of synchronicity going on here that we actually have some.
Yeah, I'm sitting there, and it's a new thing for me. This Himalayan rock salt, and I need the science of the benefits of the nutrition to get attracted to it, but she does all the research and then she comes up with some stuff, and I feel better for it, I really do feel better for it, which I have to say. So
got a good partnership going on there.
Yeah, she has encouraged me, and she's very much the nurturer, she's as Walter Cruttenden said the other night, she's a keeper, yeah, so for sure. Michael, I got to wrap it up here because I'm over the hour, as I thought I would be with yourself. How have scientists reacted to this integral connection of science and spirit that you're giving us here today for My Science, My Religion book?
Well, there's basically 3 reactions. Of course, there's a group of hardcore, materialistic, atheistic scientists who don't very much like what I'm doing. They don't want to hear it. They'd rather nobody else would hear it. So that element is there. But then there's another element that's a little more open-minded. They might not necessarily agree with me, but they're willing to listen to a presentation of ideas that integrate science and spirituality. And then there are some, they're few in number, who actually agree with me. And sometimes, you'd often be surprised. For example, once I was invited to speak about the hidden history of physics at a science university in Europe. Actually, it was in Hungary. And, I spoke to an audience of about 100 physicists and graduate students of physics about physicists who have studied, these unusual things like the Curies who were engaged studying mediums. And, I went through this whole hidden history of physics with them. And I was wondering what they were going to say. So one physicist came up to me and he said, I think it's very interesting that you're talking about these things. He says, I'm a plasma physicist. By day I'm studying the effects of superheated gases, things like that. But he said, privately, I'm doing some experiments in telepathy. He said, I have a son, he's 8 years old, and, I put him in another room and I flip a coin and he's got to guess if it's heads or tails. And he said, my son is getting 80% correct. He said, and he told me, he says, I wouldn't tell this to any of my colleagues, but I feel safe in speaking to you about it. So, as I travel around the world, I find there aren't many scientists like that who by day appear perfectly orthodox and materialistic in their science, but really they have other interests that verge into the paranormal and the spiritual. But they feel they're not able to openly discuss it. So, but there are some who are openly discussing these things, but they are few in number at the present moment.
Sure. So, look, Michael, I'm going to wrap it up there because just before I do, could you just tell us a little bit about intelligent design? I've just finished reading a book called Rethinking Darwin, which you contributed a chapter to. My friend is actually in Denmark, gave me a copy last week, just because I told him I had a show coming up about Darwin. But just for the listeners, just for the listeners, because I know you I didn't know at the time, but I know you contributed a chapter to that. But could you just tell us about the intelligent design and that challenge of Darwinian evolution? What's the difference, really?
Well, both ordinary Darwinists and intelligent design theorists see that there's a lot of complexity in biological systems. Now the question becomes, well, how does this complexity arise? One idea is, well, it arises by evolution by natural selection. But if you look in any scientific publication, you don't find any exact explanations of how that actually occurs. For example, you won't find, today, evolution operates on the idea that, well, there's variation in the genetic structure of living things that results in changes in the physical structure. And they say, well, that's how the complexity arises. But say if you look at something like the eye, it's a very complex structure. And, they would say, well, maybe a long time ago there was some little animal that didn't have a developed eye. Maybe it had just a light-sensitive spot. And they would say by genetic changes, the physical structure changed so that gradually that light-sensitive spot turned into the human eye. So that's what you read in the textbooks. But if you ask, well, what was the exact sequence of genetic changes that took place over those many millions of years that led to the formation of the eye? You can't find any detailed scientific explanation of how that actually happened. They'll just say we're working on it.
Sure, it's a guesswork, really.
But
it's guesswork.
But the intelligent design theorists say that some of this complexity is irreducible. It's not something that could happen in a step-by-step fashion. No, certainly nobody has explained exactly what those steps are. So they would propose that intelligence is necessary in order to explain the level of complexity that we observe. Just like, if you see, a smartphone sitting on your desk and you ask, well, where did that come from? You naturally think, well, it was designed and engineered, by some intelligent agency. Some intelligent engineer designed it, built it. You don't think, well, it just came about by a series of accidental, just have a bunch of elements sitting around and they start combining themselves on their own into that complex form. So intelligent design is one of the alternatives that are out there in the scientific world to the Darwinian theory of evolution. But many scientists don't like it because it involves, intelligent agency. But I'm in favor of intelligent design. I mean, as far as it goes, I think you have to go beyond even that. Because intelligent design just deals with things on the material level. They've got some material complexity, and they would say you need design to explain the complexity. But I think there's more to living systems than just molecules. There's non-material substances. There's a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers, and then there's a conscious non-material self that can exist apart from matter, and I think that's got to be part of the picture too. But if we're just talking about the material aspect of things, I think you've got to invoke intelligent design.
Okay, so Michael, we're at the top of the hour. It's been a pleasure having you. If you want to just give out your websites again, Michael, for your new book and your personal site.
Okay, my personal site is mcremo.com, mcremo.com. That will have a list of my upcoming lectures and interviews and information about all of my books. My most recent book, My Science, My Religion, has its own dedicated website, mysciencemyreligion.com. So listeners could check that out if they like.
Sure, and I'm going to have your full biography up on Capricorn Radio's webpage too. Again, Michael, thanks for having you. You have such an invaluable research, detailed, very concise and clearly laid out in your work, in your publications, and thorough scholarship. Yeah, you've been a real credit to the last 10 years of paradigm shift, I think, and before that even. But it's been a pleasure having you on the show, Michael.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. That consciousness exists separately from matter. It has its own independent existence. And what we are originally is beings of pure consciousness. So under that conception, we don't evolve up from matter, as many scientists now believe. Rather, we devolve or come down from the level of pure consciousness. So there's some scientific evidence that shows consciousness has its own independent existence. This evidence comes from medical studies of out-of-body experiences, psychiatric studies of past life memories,
and archaeology to go out and get it, because it's a good starting point, I think, for people with your work, Michael. But your latest publication from November 2012 is called My Science, My Religion. What's the elements of your newest work, Michael?
Well, this book includes 24 papers that I've presented at mainstream scientific conferences, mostly on archaeology or history of science. And these papers deal with the kind of evidence that I've reported in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and with other topics that I'm also interested in. After, people read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, they said, well, you've got all this evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins. So do you have any alternative explanation for where we came from? So to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And in that book, I said, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from? We should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? Now today, many scientists will say we're just machines made of matter. That's what we are. And as far as consciousness is concerned, they would say, well, if you combine the atoms in the brain or the molecules in the brain in a very complex way, they produce what we call consciousness, but only temporarily and only in association with the brain. When the molecules are disorganized at the time of death, then there's no more consciousness. So it's a very materialistic conception of what we are. But what I'm proposing in my book, Human Devolution, is
I have with me on the line Michael. You there, Michael?
Yes, I am. Yes,
Hi,
I
Michael.
am. I'm right here.
Sure. So, as I say, Michael, I could talk forever about ancient artifacts, and you've provided such a wealth. I urge anybody who hasn't read Forbidden